He's got a good idea.
I already hit the button, but I don't know if that means
That's okay.
there's a delay anyway, so we have like a minute delay.
Well, sort of. I mean, if we're live now, then it's happening. It's
We're
this
not
is
we're
what I'm
not quite. It's just loading.
really. It says live to me. That's what happened last time too.
I know, but it takes a while to get to YouTube. So now it's live. We are now
Okay.
live.
Hello, world. Welcome to us. We're New World Chaos. I'm Nemo, here with my co-host Jeff, and we have our special guest today, Neil Barnes. He's doing stuff related to psychology. Uh, Neil, do you feel like you got a pretty decent idea of where we're going to go with this? Or you're not totally lost since we
Yeah,
went live so
thank you,
quickly?
Nico. Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, um, there's a kind of I mean, I have a real interest at the moment in sort of development of communities, and particularly the relationship between personal autonomy and healthy community. And I know that's the community stuff is something that you've both got a real interest in, and I've heard you speak, Nemo, about personal autonomy as well. So I was wondering if we could bring those things together. And for me right now, like what's going on in the world right now, I'm really interested in sort of critical theory and critical social justice, um, and sort of the idea of that there's a real tension at the moment in society between people that support critical theory as a means to resolve social issues, and those that I would think of being as more like classically libertarian. So about the individual and individual autonomy. So there's a tension between these two ideas, and I'm really interested in that dynamic of tension and what emerges from these types of dynamics that could be very positive. So there's kind of a broad area, but I'm hoping to really just tie it into autonomy and community. If that works for you guys, then
Yeah, we love autonomy. That works for me.
Yep.
We like community too.
Yeah, self
okay.
determination. It's my bread and butter. I have been talking about self determination so much recently that yeah, I better take breaks or it's going to drive me crazy, and I'll have a whole new religion on my hands here, and we'll be back at square one at that point. Um, yeah, I. It's really cool, Neil, that you're trying to get more of a sense of clarity on these two forces that seem very different from each other that are clashing, and seems like it's such a chaotic mess that it's hard to get an idea of where the boundaries are of these loose collections of ideas. And it doesn't help that if we're going with two sides here to simplify, it does not help at all that so much of social justice comes off as a walking Frankenstein of ideals that seem to have very little to do with each other. I sometimes I hear somebody say something in social justice and I'm like, I'm so confused. I feel like my eyeballs are going to walk out of my head and say I'm done. So I'm sure you're encountering that in your own way too.
I must admit, like there is a lot of disparity in it. But I've been trying to pull together some threads, and a couple of things that have come up. Is a really strong emphasis on group and group identity, and you could see that in race theory, queer theory, post-colonialism. There's always a group that's affected and a group that's doing that affecting. So there's a real loss of individualism and a real focus on group. And I think the other area that seems very strong is a focus on problems or problematics and identifying problems. And in some way, I think that's kind of like what's good about critical theory in general is that its ability to find problems is amazing. Quite frequently, I think problems that don't exist and in fact create problems so that they can then problematize. But in fact, it's still within that there is a kind of laser focus on being able to find sometimes very real issues that need addressing. I don't agree with the method of how they're trying to address these real issues, but it does bring to light things. So I think you've got this laser problematization, but a focus on solely on group identity as being both cause and those affected. So a total loss of the individual. Um, and and it seems like everything needs to be problematized, which is probably why it feels so scrambled. It's just like, because when you start to do that, then it sometimes gets to eat itself. It becomes almost cannibalistic in an attempt to find who's the oppressed and who's the oppressor. And when you bring in something like intersectionality, where you can become increasingly narrow in identity, then you get to the point where everyone's an oppressor and everyone's oppressed. And so, for as an example, if you're a black male, then you're both oppressed by being black, but an oppressor by being male. And it just becomes so complex that there's no real way out of these sort of knots that it ties itself into. But what I've found really interesting at the moment is, in response to the existence of this social movement and political movement, is a sudden, to me it feels sudden anyway, a re-emergence around liberal values, libertarianism, which is, it's existed within our cultures for a long time. I say our as in US for you guys and UK for me. So liberal, I think most people weren't even really particularly aware that we are cultures built on liberalism and what that actually means. But having critical theory and critical justice in our culture now, there's a lot of people going, hang on a minute, I don't agree with this, but what do I agree with? And it's the re-emergence of liberal values and a re-strengthening of liberal values. And I think in that's a kind of a blessing. And then these are the two systems that are in sort of dynamic opposition. And curiously, they both have the same stated goal, which is actually social justice and liberty for people. But one group, I would say critical theory, does that in groups only. We have to liberate groups of people. The other wants to liberate everybody as an individual. And so for me, critical theory removes autonomy and replaces it with group identity. And you can only be liberated as a group. And therefore you have to fit into that group properly. So there's a lot of this sort of like in-group thinking, groupthink. If you don't adhere to the group's identity, then you don't belong in the group. It's very tribal. And then what I see in liberalism is the idea that, well, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how you identify. It doesn't matter what groups you belong to or don't belong to. Everyone has this. There's a universal, everyone has the same rights and to be. And that's the liberal approach to trying to achieve the same goal. But they seem to be almost diametrically opposed at the moment. But I do think what's emerging from this tension actually is a resurgence in really making sure liberal values count. And in fact, I think we can all acknowledge that despite the successes of liberal culture over the last, let's just say the last 60 years as a solid example, say from civil rights movement onwards, we're seeing massive advances in social freedom, movements towards equality. There's still a ways to go. It's not perfect by any means. And there's still problems that need to be resolved. And critical theory has made sure that everyone's aware of those problems. So, in some ways, thank you for really bringing back to light that there are issues that need resolving. Yes, there are. You're spot on. I don't think dividing people into groups and pitting them against each other is going to solve those problems. I think it's going to take us backwards. But in response to that, liberalism, people are standing up again and saying, hang on a minute, I have really strong liberal values and I really believe in equality, but I'm actually going to do something about it because there's been a call to action almost. So that's the kind of what I mean by these sort of like opposites in sort of like a dynamic system, and dynamic systems of any type, even like doing this with my arm, requires sets of tendons and sets of muscles which work in opposition. Otherwise my arm would either do that and not go in the other way or just flop open and I wouldn't be able to do anything. So I need both, right? That's true in every system, including political systems. Probably why both our countries have partisan systems of politics. So critical theories raised itself up like some kind of hydra, multi-headed sort of creature that's attempting to divide everything up, and the dynamic opposite has come into play. And in fact, I'm starting to feel that there's something really positive that can be taken from this. And one of those things may well be, I hope personally, is the acknowledgement of the importance of individual liberty, and that individual liberty is best served through personal autonomy. And
Yeah.
and so I feel that we can move towards personal autonomy through this dynamic. And I also believe that most people will agree that healthy communities form where everyone can be themselves. And that again speaks very strongly to personal autonomy. So yeah, I think that's where what I'm seeing happening, how I'm reacting to what's happening. And in me personally, I feel a very strong drive to really getting to understand what personal autonomy is, how we can enable that for ourselves and for others, and how that leads to healthy communities. And in fact, I'm very interested in building healthy communities with people that understand personal autonomy. And intellectually, I'm really interested in the connections. Why does that work that way? Can it be evidenced? I'm sure that it can. I haven't done all the work yet, but I'm sure that it can. But I think as an experience, and I think we can speak to it quite easily. You know, we can demonstrate it through our own lives. But I'm also really interested in kind of like mapping it out well enough to be able to even, you know, support and enable others to take that journey.
Amen. Um, there's so many potential themes to like pull apart at this, but the one that's standing out to me right now, if I'm going back to an older part of history, that there's all, when you talk about systems of opposites that sometimes conflict with each other, and then there's wars, and there's whole religions, or there's clubs, and there's football teams, whichever example you want to use. One of the pairs of opposites that I've started to become more aware of is individualism versus collectivism. And this is not a paradigm of that I really ever use. I think it's a little bit falling out of practice, and it's getting characterized in new language in new ways, and it's getting somewhat covered up. But in much of the 20th century, if I'm becoming more aware of a bigger historical context, it seems like a lot of countries and societies worldwide were very focused on collectivism versus individualism. I think this is a more simplistic way of looking at a similar conflict that I would really describe as autonomy versus authority. There's another way of describing it is autonomy versus relationships. So there's really two different things happening here, and they're getting really entangled. On one hand, you have people that have a strong need for community and relationships, and they desire that, and they move in that direction, and they'll sacrifice autonomy to reach for those relationships because of their personality type. They're more agreeable, or they enjoy caring for other people. Maybe they want a family, whatever it might be. And they may not even realize how much their own autonomy is in conflict with relationships. This is especially common if they grow up in a dysfunctional household and they have their boundaries crossed as a kid by their parents. And so now those two things are in conflict instead of them both being needs that are important. The other version of this conflict is autonomy versus authority. And so, again, if you're a little kid and you grew up with authoritarian parents or in a relatively authoritarian culture, then it's going to be the authority figures and who is deemed as being in power in competition with each individual's autonomy. These two conflicts are similar but different. And when you turn it into this individualism versus collectivism paradigm, it gets really muddy and it's very hard to understand. So if we want to simplify and try to de-muddy it, I think the desire towards collectivism is a desire for relationships and community because it gives us meaning. It makes us feel like we're paid attention to and loved and we're listened to and empathized with. And then the desire for individualism is that desire for autonomy, for my own hero's journey, to be unique as one individual, to express my own art. And these desires keep getting divorced from each other, and people have a hard time finding a way to have both. And so then they feel like they're being split in half almost. And different personality types will go to one extreme or another. And if you get people that are really desperate and they don't figure out their own inner demons, they will also lose autonomy and become authoritarian or obedient. So it's a big entangled mess. There's like multiple opposing paradigms here. And I don't even know if I did a good job of trying to navigate it because it's very disorienting.
I agree. I
Well,
can't always.
think,
Oh, go ahead, Neil, please.
no, please, Jeff.
No,
Rock, paper,
Go
scissors.
first.
I don't want to lose your thought. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. What I picked up on was like at the social level where you've got individualism versus collectivism, and it feels like collectivism is essentially the sort of extension of the need to be in social groups to survive, and to what level of emphasis does that social group have over the individual in terms of survival? So in a natural wild environment without any tools, the collectivism is what keeps every individual alive, and if you're not part of the group you will die. So that there's a very strong kind of social biological need for collectivism in that respect. But in a modern culture, that's not necessary. Like, it really just isn't as necessary anymore. Yet I think for lots of people, the way you relationship is the tool and process by which that collectivism maintains itself. So the autonomy versus relationship, I think, is very much autonomy versus collectivism as you described it. But then with relationship, you can just start to look at the individual and how the individual is affected rather than just talking about the group. So with collectivism, you're really talking about almost like a bird's eye objective view. How does the group survive? How important is group behavior in terms of group survival? And you can look at some cultures where that's so strongly emphasized that individualism is kind of almost a dirty word, and the group always comes first. And that's very functional. It does work, but it doesn't always serve the individual best. And I guess what I'm thinking of is that community doesn't have to be collective.
Right.
Community can be very individualistic if the relationships are not authoritarian. And I think that's
Beautiful.
For me, these threads come together in that manner, that if we learn how to relate to each other as autonomous individuals with the respect and love and care for each other as that, we can organize as a collective or a community, I would prefer to say. And we don't need to subjugate our individualism for that to function. But I think the assumption that we do comes from a more like classical need of survival in a wild environment, and it certainly seems to be embedded in some cultures more than other.
Yes, I think that's a great rephrasing.
I really
Yeah. Jeff, what did you want to say? Do you remember?
Well, I was gonna talk about my observations on collectivism, because I observe it all the time around me. And what you were saying about relationship versus authority, I can never tell if it's the authority or the relationships that I don't know what draws people to collectivism, because I'm not wired that way. But I don't know if it's the authority of the group, like the group represents or provides them with a sense of authority to navigate life by, or whether it's the relationships. Because collectivism, from my observation, can cover both. So maybe that's why it does get conflated. Um, but to see other people as an individual and to start building the types of communities Neil's talking about, you have to have a sense of yourself as an individual. I've always had a strong sense of self. And so I don't know how you develop if you don't have that sense of self, like finding ways to develop in others, because although I can't imagine it, perhaps people that are drawn to collectivism don't have a sense of self in the first place, or they have a very weak sense of self. And so I think people with a stronger sense of self tend to see other people as individuals more than as groups. And so that could be part of this dynamic too, is varying degrees of, do you experience yourself as an individual versus do you experience yourself as a member of a group?
Yeah, that's a pretty good one. Side note here, I'm wondering if Neil has a slightly more of a delay than us, maybe because he's across an ocean, but that might be something to watch for if we talk over each other or whatever. But I think that's a great point, Jeff. And this reminds me of something that's part of. So I'm really exploring and building this wacky, ridiculous philosophy I call intrinsic abundance. Neil was awesome. He's like freaking our number one fan. It seems like he watched my whole introduction series to intrinsic abundance. It's about an hour long. That's the easiest way to get into it. Otherwise, it's very hard to summarize. But to bring in one little piece that's relevant here, this is a bit out of context, but I'll do what I can with it. I find that psychologically, when a person wants to try to be selfless, what you might call altruistic, it fails because each of us are living as individuals. Like biologically, that's a perception, that's like a functional part of being a living creature of pretty much almost any kind. Most living creatures seem to be individualized to some degree. So then, if a person tries to be selfless and that's their idea of being good, and they must be selfless to be good, and they can't separate those two, it fails and it turns into self-hatred. It's like they're trying to get rid of their own individuality. And uh, this reminds me of Marshall Rosenberg, the founder of nonviolent communication. Two of his quotes I'll say back to back. One of them is, if you seek to get rid of something, it leads to violence. And the second one is, saying what you don't want doesn't make it clear what you do want. And when I put those two together in my head, it gives me this real strong clarity of why there are various figures and movements in history that are deeply antagonized by the society they're born into, and they feel like prisoners or just too alien, too different, for better or worse. And if they don't find a way to a path that feels empowering to them, that they can manage, where they can find some place for themselves, then they become very destructive to that society. We see this in individual people and figures like the Unabomber is an interesting example. Christopher McCandless is one of my favorites. He was pretty interesting. From the book and the movie Into the Wild, if anyone wants to look that up. And it's like there's this man versus himself and man versus society archetype going on here. And I think almost in a way, I'm one of those people, or like I've spent much of my life being like really struggling with me versus society and not knowing how on earth I'm going to find a place in it as on the fringe, more in society. It's very, very difficult. And if a society becomes more anti-human and unable to meet the needs of more people, then eventually there's revolution, there's chaos, there's disaster, and the ship sinks. And we may be dealing with something going in that direction to some degree.
I think, kind of what Jeff started with leads into that quite naturally in how do we see ourselves and how do we project that onto others. So I think Jeff said, if we see ourselves as an individual, we tend to see others as individuals. and psychologically, that's a process of kind of projection. We assume others to be the same in some way, and in a sense, it's the same with if we validate ourselves as being members of groups, then we validate others as being members of groups too, or expect them to do the same. So when someone with a group mentality talks to someone with an individuality, unless it's really stated, like overtly stated that this is happening, there's these underlying assumptions about, like I'm going to take the role of the group mentality person, and I'm talking to say Jeff, who's has an individual mentality, and I'm going to be thinking that he thinks of himself as a member of a group and speaking on behalf of that group, and what he thinks is what the group thinks, and therefore I'm putting him in groups depending on what he says, even though he's only representing himself. So that process, I think, can very much lead to what you described, Nemo, in terms of that sense of being on the fringe or being isolated, because we're not having conversations about, this is how I experience the world, how do you experience the world? And then once that's kind of clear, from that basis, we can start to see there's differences, and we can start to work out what those differences might mean, and how do we then start to relate to one another. And I think that something else that a not necessarily a weak sense of self, although I understand that framing of it, but maybe the way that we validate ourselves in terms of, because we all need relationships. I think that's inevitably true, and we all look for community in our own ways. And I would say that the three of us would all be really happy in communities of autonomous people. And yet we could probably find three people that would not at all, really not even being able to understand or articulate what that means. And equally, I just cannot see myself as being in any way interesting by my group identities. So like, yeah, I'm white, so what? I'm male, so what? You know, my eyes are blue, so what? I'm British, so what? Like, that is just of zero interest to me. I don't know why it'd be of interest to anybody else, but it clearly is. And you know, that kind of in some way creates two types of human beings, but ultimately we all still want something that's quite common, which is a sense of belonging. I want to belong with people that get me and are like me, you know, and other people want the same. But what I think is quite important is that so particularly for those that are quite individually minded or autonomous in themselves, so autonomous people trying to fit into a collective situation can be very easily rejected based on in-group, out-group. And I think that is quite dangerous. What I tend to experience is people that are quite autonomous and also tend to be quite heterodox as well, I think, are much less likely to kick someone out of the group, because they're much more likely to accept the differences as just being, well, that's you and that's fine, because I'm different too and that's fine. And I think that people with a collective need, let's call it, I think they really struggle with difference, and I think that is affecting our societies right now, and particularly different ways of thinking. I mean, surface differences are really easy to see, which is why I was saying my gender or racial identity or anything is just so of little or zero interest whatsoever. Right? What's interesting to me is what goes on inside, like how you think, how you see the world, what you value and why. But that's so much more difficult to grasp, and it requires this type of interaction. It requires sorts of discussion and open-minded discussion. And it's very hard to do that if you're automatically pigeonholing the person in front of you by group. So I'm kind of like asking myself the question now, why do we do that at all? And what can we do about it in terms of the autonomy thing. And I'm starting to already answer the question why I feel healthy communities based on autonomy may be healthier than communities based on collectivism. As long as that, I think there is a singular need that we all have. And I think identifying that's quite important. And I think that goes back to relationship. We all need relationship. None of us survive alone. And I think for me personally, that's part of the fact that love is an essential part of being a human being, and that we need to be loved and we need to love others, and that brings connection, and connection is a very nourishing experience. How much are we willing to trade for that? And I think that's and I think collectivism does play on that quite a bit. People are willing to trade their autonomy in order to be held, in really sort of simple language. And there's something about competence as well, for me, that the less competent you feel, and I don't mean to say the less competent you are, I think it's more about how you feel about your own competence, which we could call confidence, in fact, is that feeling of competence in ourselves. If we don't feel competent and we want to be part of a group, then we will look to those with authority to tell us how to be part of the group, and then we're safe, right? Whereas if you kind of have some confidence in yourself and are kind of like, yeah, I can stand on my own, whether that's physically or emotionally or cognitively, then you don't need anyone else's authority.
Yeah,
because you have your own.
That's
So
that. That's
think
what I
for
was.
people.
Go ahead. Neil, go.
Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna finish this up, and then I'm gonna kind of like hand over. So I think you're right. There's a bit of transatlantic lag in the conversation that's interfering slightly. So yeah, what I was gonna say was for me, the road from autonomy to healthy community in particular is helping people establish their own competence and confidence in themselves. And in doing that, there's less need to hand over to the authority of others. I think that's really just kind of what I was heading towards to close. So Jeff, please.
What you're calling confidence that's what I mean by sense of self. And so I think we're talking about the same thing there.
Okay.
And I've had to learn this in my own personal life as an autistic person. We have a concept in the autism community. It's social confluence. When people come together in groups, it's like water flowing into each other, or two rivers meeting and merging and flowing into each other. That's what neurotypicals tend to do when they come together. And as an autistic person, I don't do that when I'm with group. I'm pretty much the same whether I'm in an individual or with the group. I'm like a rock in the stream that the water flows around. And I've seen this with coworkers in staff meetings. So like, let's say Nemo and I are coworkers and we have this individual relationship, and I know him as Nemo and we're friends and we hang out. When we go to a staff meeting, Nemo becomes a different person because he starts to take on this group identity with the other coworkers at the staff meeting. So I've had to learn that the Nemo I hang out with one-on-one is not the Nemo that's going to show up in a staff meeting once this social confluence kind of takes over. And I've always had the sense that people become different people when they're in groups or meetings or staff meetings. And wait, I thought that was Nemo. That's my friend. He's this way, but he's acting this way in the meeting, and I don't know who this person is. And I had to learn all that in order for me to navigate that. So another concept from the autism community is theory of mind, which is exactly what you were talking about, of how we take the way we see the world and we make assumptions on how the other person is seeing it, based on our own theory of mind. And there's techniques and practices that we can do as autistic people that help us figure out what other people's theory of mind are and when our theory of mind is at play. But I think everyone has a theory of mind. And I think those techniques work across the board. They work for different cultures, different genders, different individual assumptions that we bring, like whether you're a group person or a more autonomous person, you're going to have an entirely different theory of mind based on that. So those are all concepts that might illuminate the situation and provide a way forward as well.
Yeah. I'm really excited, and I want to jump in here because all these different things, I just see them all connecting together through the lens that I want to reference. I'm going to bring this towards locus of control with some of the things that both Neil and Jeff that you've both brought up. Um, so, a quick definition for in case anybody hasn't heard of it, like listeners, whoever, but locus of control is a description of where you believe your control is or the control. I may not be giving the best definition here, but people with an external sense or locus of control have more tendency to believe or perceive that the autonomy, the choices, the control is in the world outside of them, or it's beyond their control as an individual. So they're, in a way, external locus of control is a person getting cut off from their own autonomy. By contrast, if they have an internal locus of control, then it's more related to having a real sense physically, mentally, emotionally, socially that you make choices and it's coming from within you. And to some extent, both of these have truth to it. You know, I'm an individual and I make choices for my own life. And no matter what anyone else does outside of me, they can't live through my body and literally animate me like a puppet. Even if they're the biggest authoritarian ever, all they can do are look for the tools they have to manipulate, coerce, scare me, complain, or maybe they can use healthier tools and try to collaborate, communicate, and so forth. But I also have no control over the things that happen outside of me. So there's like this inside and an outside. And one of the great struggles, as I see it, as a human being, one person, is to make your peace with this shared reality that there's an inside, your realm, where you make choices, and there's an outside where you really don't, you can't do much about it at all. It's like every drop in the ocean makes a vote of what direction the wave goes, and then you just see what happens. And the reason this came up for me, and I'm so excited about this, is because I'm seeing patterns between people who have very external locus of control. They have a lack of sense of self identity. They're more likely to be collectivists, and they're more likely to sense they have little to no autonomy. And some of these people may even be literally like deterministic, where they almost think that choices or free will doesn't exist at all. I don't even care whether free will is real or not. I have this experience subjectively, physically, sense of presence that I move around, I make choices, I'm the one who climbs the mountain, I'm the one who lives my hero's journey. And for me, I'm going to personalize this because I think this is going to be the easiest way to summarize this and make it really clear. The more that I have been effectively able to strengthen myself internally. Physically, I'm getting stronger. I've gone through physical therapy. I've gone through trauma healing for PTSD. My health has gotten better. And I've every day, whether it's a horrible day, a good day, or something else, every time I reinforce this, I'm making this choice. What do I do about this? How do I respond to the chaos of reality? The more I feel my life that I live and inhabit is in this world of my choices. It's almost like a physical thing. Like Jordan Peterson, when he says clean up your room or whatever, he also when he goes into the more esoteric philosophy of that, he says psychologically your room is a representation of what's in your mind. And so if your room is really messy, your mind is really messy, or vice versa. And there's this relationship to what you experience internally and how you experience the outer world as a result. And if a person is really tied to externalizing everything and having very little autonomy, they start to feel like they literally are a victim of reality or life itself. Whatever their belief system is, they tend to throw pity parties, say, poor me. And it's very hard for them to imagine making choices and seeing that their choices matter. They devalue their own lives and choices. And it's really a long or difficult process to shift that. And so a lot of social justicey people I encounter, they care very little about themselves, but they also seem to be kind of sensationalists at the same time. They desire being almost famous. They want to be famous activists. And it seems like that's like this junk food that they try to feed themselves because they have so little sense of self and so little sense of quality community and meaning in their lives that they're looking for a kind of famousness as they're filling that void in life. I need to be famous with my group and we're going to save the world and it's going to be a utopia. But if they could be more internal and begin to treat their lives and their choices as if it really matters, even if it's experimental, even if they don't believe it, it could radically change things. But it's a very difficult process to do, and from what I've experienced.
That's really strikes me, because I've been asking myself this question for the last about week, is that why do so many people with a strong critical social justice social media presence also have, and this is just using Twitter as one example, why is their Twitter handles and their profiles almost like really like aggressively against themselves? Just like some of the names that people use, some of the handles they use on Twitter are just so negative towards themselves, and I keep looking at it and thinking, like, that nasty bitch was one I come across the other day, and it's just like, why would anyone describe themselves like that?
Yeah.
And you've kind of just spoken to why just now, and I was like, oh yeah, like that really does is demonstrated in the self-presentation. And the other thing that you said that I thought that has also just like rang a bell in my head is so thank you for saying it, is like it's to do with that. So you can, people that think that they're, if the world is, if the locus of control is completely external, and there's no internal locus of control, it must seem to them that when people do say, no, I have control of myself, then I imagine it appears as if people, let's say I've got an internal locus of control, or predominantly so, because I also acknowledge that, like the serenity prayer, there are things I can change and things I can't. Give me the wisdom to know the difference. So I know that there is stuff in the world I can't change, and I know the thing I've got most control over is myself. But it must appear that I may be giving up on trying to change the world to make the world a better place. And I think I've heard that from people that have a social justice mentality, is that you can't just give up on trying to fix the problems in the world. It's selfish just to look after yourself. So selfish and looking after self. But I think the point that's being missed there, and that's probably coming from a lack of experience of having internal control and autonomy, is that when you do change yourself, your impact in the world is easier to direct and is greater. This is my experience. The stronger I am, like you describing yourself as becoming stronger, Nemo, through the processes that you're undertaking, and what I'm seeing is a strong person. That's how I experience you. So, and I believe that when we do strengthen ourselves, we have much greater capacity to impact the world around us. So what I'm saying is, if you do want to change the world, the first thing you need to do is be strong. And the stronger and clearer you are in terms of your own sense of self, and then the much easier it is for you to take a direction and stick with it. You're not going to be so easily, going back to what Jeff said about when people come together, they lose some of their sort of individual self and become part of the stream. Well, how do you kind of like, how do you implement a change in the world if you're easily influenced into joining a different stream when one comes along, in order to implement a change in the world around you, you need to be able to stick with that goal and direction and purpose. And it is much easier to do that when you have a strong sense of self and autonomy and an internal locus of control. You can maintain focus on a goal. You're not going to be easily distracted or convinced of something else. So I feel a group of people who have a strong sense of self and a shared goal can have a much greater impact than a shared goal that is than people that believe that the world is in control of everything, and then they're trying to change that. Like, how do you change the world if the world's in control of everything? If everything's external to you, how do you have an impact? If essentially, I don't know if you believe that you can. So what you do is shout at everyone else that it's their fault and that they need to do something about it. And I get that a lot in social justice. It's like, it's basically going around saying it's your fault, you need to change, you need to do something about it. And my response to that now is like, why? Because you feel you can't. Like, what's going on there, what's missing? Yeah, maybe I can change the world, but only if I've got a sense of who I am and what I'm bringing into the world. And the stronger I am as an individual, the more impactful I can be. And that should be a positive thing. That shouldn't be like, I'm going to bend the world to my will, like some kind of, like some kind of God trying to like selfishly impose my will upon the world. Not at all. Just by having internal strength, I can see, I can give that in service to a goal that the world needs. But so yeah, that's what I'm really feeling, and I think that's, and yeah, that, okay, I'm getting really quite lively inside now. That's why I feel communities that are built on autonomy will be so strong and healthy. This is for exactly that reason. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
This is such a great discussion.
that's one thing that keeps coming up is these communities built on autonomy. And I think that's another thing we were going to spend some time talking about today. Are places where people can show up and be themselves, as you describe it, which is the environments that I've benefited from myself growing up and that I try to create in the work that I do as well. So,
Yeah.
Do you have some examples?
well, I have a drop-in Zoom that I run pretty much morning to night throughout the day that people can drop in on, and we've kind of created that. I went to a residential school for gifted children growing up, and it was very much the environment that kind of fostered our finding of our own identity and being ourselves and finding what our strengths are and how to use our strengths. It wasn't very programmatic. And I think I carried that. It really influenced me a lot. And I think I've carried that into everything I've done since then. So my whole instinct, whether it's a support group, a Zoom community, I've done in-person communities. I've had several meetup groups. They've all been spaces where people can show. There's not a lot of rules or you have to be this before you can be a member. It's just show up as you are and let us get to know you as you are. And I see a lot of people kind of find their voice, kind of discover who they are, discover their strengths, have that nurtured. I see so much growth and development in these communities. People will show up maybe not confident in themselves, a little unsure of themselves. They'll find talents that they might not have gotten to practice much, and I try to help nurture that. So I've seen a lot of growth. Are people that are not socially confident, I see them start to connect more with other people, start to form relationships, start to have quality conversations, maybe for the first time in their life. So I find if you hold a certain type of space, which is all I really think that I do, is hold a space, there's a process that kind of organically takes over when people that are somewhere on the path to autonomy, somewhere on the spectrum, like not completely collectivist. When they come together, there's kind of all feeds each other to I don't know what I'm trying to say. There's a process that kind of takes over and it starts to grow on its own. We see that in CTA, critical therapy antidote, and we do a lot of Zooms, and there's several groups, CTA special interest groups, and in every one of those, as well as CTA as a whole, I've seen this dynamic. I've seen numerous generally autonomous people, mostly mental health professionals and clients, come together and kind of reinforce each other as individuals and harness that energy that they all generate collectively, but not in a collectivist way. I think it's the difference between the communal and the collective, and kind of grow and develop. I mean, part of this podcast developed out of Counterweight and CTA, which are two of the communities out there that I would call healthy, authentic communities that I think support autonomy and authenticity.
Amen. Um, yeah, what this is reminding me of, especially since we're naturally coming more into the territory of community building, and we're emphasizing, say, not just relationships, but relationships and communities that are really effective and not just empowering, but can maintain that, and they develop resilience, and that's a lot of what I've been researching in the last few years. And I did a research paper last year that was youth focused, because youth mentorship and advocacy and kind of the nonprofit world outside of school systems, that's been my turf for about 6 years, 7 years now, actually. So we're already in 2021. Boy, time flies when life is chaos. Uh, but I want to bring in something from my research that I think is going to be a little easier to summarize and is not going to be too dense. I'm going to try and make it simpler. There's a book that's not that well known, but I think is really cool, and I'm trying to make the concept more well known. It's called the book was called "The Great Good Place" by Ray Oldenburg from 1989, and the main concept that he's come up with is called the third place. It's also been referred to as the third space. The first space is we consider it our home. That's where you rest. That's where your family and most personal life experiences are. That's like shelter. It's where you meet your basic needs. You kind of return to your turf every day. And the second place we consider the workplace, and that's where you do your job. If you want to be broader than that, you could say that the workplace is where you go to do something that's purposeful, practical, where you go there frequently. And usually you do it with other people. The third place, as he has defined it, is it's almost like this town square, or it's this open area that's almost a crossroads for people to meet each other. And there's this flexibility and open endedness to it. And it's where community is formed, new and old relationships. And it's got a very distinct set of qualities, and he found 8 qualities that really define like the highest quality, most empowering and profound third places. So it's almost like this is the foundation and the community container for us to begin grappling with all of these issues we have, and with discovering our own hero's journey, but also coming into the larger stream together and dealing with all of that and finding friends along the way. And um, so the 8 qualities, I'm going to try and go through this and not go on too long, but the first one is neutral ground. So what it means is that occupants have little or no obligation to be there, not financially, politically, etc. So it's autonomy. They're free to come and go as they please. A leveling place is the second aspect. Third places place no importance on individual status in society. So hierarchy is de-emphasized, or it's not strongly tethered. Um, and then the third one is conversation is the main activity. So conversation that is playful or open-ended can be one of the ways that people build relationships. And it's almost like the glass grapes on a table in a 1950s home. You have something that brings people together. Fourth one is accessibility and accommodation. Third places are readily open and accessible to those who occupy them and are accommodating to the needs of the participants. Fifth one is the regulars. Third places have a small collection of regulars that frequently. Uh-oh, I think my camera went off. I'm going to keep going. Just ignore the camera. But the number of regulars, that is the small group of people, they set the mood, the tone, they welcome in new people, and they help form new relationships. And then six is a low profile. Third places are wholesome and they're casual, and they don't really project grandiosity or a desire for famousness. They're not snobby or pretentious. Number seven is the mood is playful. The tone or conversation in third places is never tense or hostile, but is accepting, humorous, and playful. And number eight is a home away from home. Occupants from the third place tend to create a sense of warmth, compassion, personability, and love together. So that's my little summary there. And yeah, I don't know. I think those characteristics can be used as kind of our blueprint a little, to at least as a source of inspiration for us to build our sense of third space.
I would say every one of the. In fact, can you send that to me? I would say every single one of those we currently have going on at the back porch, which is the Zoom community that I run. I guess I just instinctively or intuitively create that type of space, those values. But one of the ones, I don't remember which number it was, but it was the one about open conversation. That's the one that I've had to work at the most in actively creating. And partly it's because of the social justice mentality. People come in here and they try to control speech, they try to control for offense. It's always imagined, it's no one that's around that's actually being offended. It's imaginary people that may show up sometime in the future that could possibly hear the conversation and become offended. So I've had to fight really hard to keep the conversation free and open against some of the social justice mentality. And I think that's one reason that the back porch is so valuable right now, is because I have figured out how to hold a space that conversation can stay free and open. But every item on that list is not only an inspiration, it's being actualized right now on these Zoom communities that I'm seeing.
I've got to say that, and
Did we lose
a lot of
Nemo?
that.
I'm still here. Please continue
Okay.
without me for a few minutes. I'm going to
Sure.
replace
No.
my camera battery and you'll see me again.
Okay. In fact, I'm going to let Neil say what he wanted to say, and then we can even start taking callers or guests, because we're coming up on about an hour.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I wanted to say that, well, one, like listening to it, that list, the first thing was that I was thinking, yeah, I've experienced that one. Yeah, I've experienced that. That one I was thinking of beforehand. Um, it sounded so natural as being a sort of a nice place to be. And I wonder if that's because I have that sense of autonomy and the importance of that. And when I feel that's important for me, then I feel it's important for others to have that too. But I think it does give a really nice framework for consciously developing communities in, if it's not something that already comes immediately natural, as you know, you said for yourself, Jeff, you kind of already employ all of those things in what you do without really having to think about it. But if you are someone that does need to think about it, or are curious as to put a framework in place, I think that works really, really well. And I'd love to see more spaces like that growing, and for people to be able to sort of participate in. And you mentioned Counterweight as well before. Does that provide a similar space, or is it a doorway into similar spaces, or?
I'll try to answer based on my experiences. I've been more active than Jeff in Counterweight the last, I don't know, couple of months or so. I think Jeff is getting really connected to some of the groups he's building. One of the ones, as a side note, one of the ones I'm most excited about is Critical Therapy Antidote. And we tend to link to all the groups relevant in our descriptions on our And wherever we're publishing, you should be able to find our links. Um, and so I met Neil. Neil, I met you. I don't know who I'm talking to right now. The audience, you, whoever, but Neil, I met you on Critical Therapy Antidote, or we call it CTA for short. And that's a wonderful group. It's just a collection of therapists and psychology oriented people that are concerned about social justice. And we're starting to form relationships that way. But then one of the areas for community building where I interact the most myself is Counterweight, and that's how I met Jeff. And through Jeff, I've gotten connected to all these other people, and this movement, this counter movement to social justice, is forming rapidly, organically, and chaotically. And it's very disorienting. And so one of the notions or the concepts I've found that's really useful for the town square or the third place is the sense of having a place to arrive. This was not specified in any of the 8 qualities of the third place that I listed, but I've seen this in other research for people that want to design any environment to meet the needs of many people in groups where they're decentralized or each person's doing their own thing, or when the groups are interacting more proactively. I read about this, in fact, with the design of grocery stores. There's a book, I forget the name of it, but it's by Paco Underhill. I'm sure you can find it by that name. But he writes about designing grocery stores. And if you have a place to arrive, then each individual person, they have all this noisiness, and there's all this chaos, and they're bringing that with them because the world is just utter chaos, and we're packed full of information. It's almost overwhelming to know what to do at all. And uh, and so when they arrive in these grocery stores, if they have a big enough parking lot, then it helps the person almost like they're an airplane landing on the landing strip and they can slow down by walking through the parking lot. And then when they get inside, it's designed so that it starts to split them off so people go in different directions and they're not just ramming into the first aisle of grocery items they see and everybody falls over and it's a mess. It's this absurd psychological thing, but you can see how metaphorically that applies to a bunch of places. That when you don't know where to start and you don't even know how to build a third place and everything's a mess, you sort of just grab on to whatever you can and you put together this Frankenstein, messy, ridiculous boat in the middle of the storm, you could say, and you survive the storm, and then you can start to build a better boat. And so with Counterweight, so one, I really like the group. It's a pretty large group, so most people are going to be able to find their niche. And if you clash with somebody, it's usually not that big of a deal. And then you just go find other people in another part of the group, and it honestly tends to work itself out for the most part. It's not as common that a person is going to be totally deterred from Counterweight in my experience. And if you are, that's fine because there are tons of groups that are forming. This is forming itself so quickly that it's just like hop on board and find a wave to ride and see what happens and just enjoy the ride and the improvisation and the craziness. And if you can see that you're coming into a group like Counterweight and it feels like a place to arrive with all of your messiness and the pain of life that and the struggle that many of us have right now, if you can find that place where you can arrive just as you are, a total mess, and together in your messiness discover refuge, something in common, playfulness, humor, where you can just kind of relax a little bit and you don't have to worry about being constantly judged or bothered or people criticizing you and all the ways that you're imperfect. And you're like, let's just start with being human and let's keep it simple. Oh, that's your favorite color too? Great. We've made it. Step one, we have one thing in common. We don't have to freak out and tear each other to shreds now. Oh, you like that type of food too? I like it. Okay, let's cook that food together and let's eat that food. And you just take it one step at a time. And I feel very fortunate and grateful that I'm starting to discover that. I don't know. That was a crazy, ridiculous way to answer the question. I'm sure it went all over the place.
That was a good answer. I
Well,
guess you should mention that Counterweight is mostly, there's a Discord server that they meet on that you can join once you sign up for Counterweight. I also have a Discord that I run that's similar. It's devoted to people interested in the impact of critical social justice. And we talked about critical therapy antidote. I run a weekly Zoom on Wednesdays, and there's a lot of CTA members that meet there, but it's open to anyone. And again, the kind of common thread is this reaction to critical social justice. So if you're interested in the Discord or joining us on the Zoom, you can just email me at jeffanemo@gmail.com and I can send you a link.
thank you. Like what really appeals to me in that is sort of people being maybe stimulated by what's going on to, and people may be negatively impacted by what's going on and feel the need to be heard and to hear others that feel the same way. And that sounds like that's what these spaces are providing. And so looping this back to how this conversation kind of started, and like what's positive that's emerging from what's going on. And it for me, I think one thing that's very positive that's emerging from what's going on is not just the resurgence or reawareness of libertarian values in a classical libertarian sense, not a neoliberal or modern, but a truly individualism sense and universal rights sense, is creating spaces for people to really embody that and to develop that. And I've had a few experiences in some groups where some other people within those groups have had very different ideas to me and things that I don't agree with. But what I really loved about being in that space was that I could hear an opinion that I can completely say, like, no, I just do not agree with that whatsoever. But it's the idea that I don't agree with, not the person or their existence. And it was possible to navigate a conversation which actually led to some learning, and I found a lot of kindness and friendship with people that I don't agree with.
Yeah.
And that's really healthy to be able to be in a community where I can say, I don't agree with you, but hey, let's grab a beer or let's carry on chatting because I still like you as a person. I just don't agree with how you think about things. And why shouldn't that be possible? And that, in fact, isn't that where new ideas come from? Where different ideas meet? Like, because if we all got together and agreed that we all think the same way about everything, nothing would ever change. In fact, if that had been the course of human history, that they'd never, that we've got group identity and no one disagrees about anything, we'd probably still be in caves. Like, anything new that emerges in the world normally comes from someone doing something different, and maybe other people going, that's a good idea, and other people going, that's a bad idea. And particularly when it's a bad idea, if you address what's wrong with that idea thoughtfully and creatively, then you can then find something better. And so I don't mind coming up with bad ideas and someone going, that's a terrible idea, you didn't think about this, and then going, light bulb moment, well, now we're heading towards a good idea. So I feel it's so necessary to be able to go, no, I don't agree with you, but I still respect you or a living being, so let's work on this and see what we can come out with. So it sounds like that these spaces that are being created in response to critical theories impacting on social justice in the world is actually creating spaces where people can exercise autonomy, strengthen and grow autonomy, and new ideas and new communities can be formed. So it could be the birthplace of something really quite beautiful in that community sense. And I'd be really, I mean, I know you said you wanted to open to questions, Jeff, so I'm gonna wrap myself up here. But I'd be really interested in having future discussions with you both about like really directively building communities. Like, actually, I know you guys both are, so maybe just strengthening what you're already doing, or possibly even I know, working with others that are wanting to do the same, and perhaps
Yeah,
providing a sort of a supportive space to help people do that, like
I would
a
love that.
community
Yeah.
startup program. That's that. I mean, something along those lines, because I think this is really, really what's needed at the moment. So yeah, this has
Thank you for
been
that.
great. I've really, really enjoyed this. I've given me a lot of food for thought, and so thank you both very much.
Well, thank you for joining us. And I don't know who's out there watching or listening, but if anybody has questions or wants to comment, there's a few commenters on YouTube today. If anyone wants to join us on the Zoom, just comment in the YouTube section and we can get you on. Send you a link.
Yeah.
If otherwise, we can just keep chatting for a while.
Yeah. Well, yeah, since there is a little bit of a delay between what people see on the YouTube video and it's like a 1 minute delay or whatever.
Something like that.
But I think we have two people that are watching and they actually did comment a number of times. And I opened the
Three
video
now.
and I'm kind of checking it out, talking to people a little bit. Um, I'll see. Let's see if anybody wants to hop on. But until then, somebody just asked if CTA and the back porch are the same thing or different groups. I just quickly said they're different groups, but Jeff, that you're active in both. So, Jeff, do you want to describe some of the key differences a little more between the two groups?
The back porch started. It was started by some peers here in Washington State, and it was centered more on mental health support. But it is overlapping. We have several of our peers that have joined CTA and attend the CTA Zooms. We have CTA people that hang out on the back porch, and Counterweight's the largest organization so far. But within Counterweight, there's also a subset of people that are part of CTA as well. So between Counterweight, CTA, which is Critical Therapy Antidote, and the back porch, there's this little core group that kind of flows back and forth between the three groups. And so I think any of those could be a pathway into some form of the kind of community that we're talking about.
Do they have any geographical focus?
Mm, not really. They're mostly virtual. Counterweight was started in the UK by Helen Pluckrose. CTA was started in the UK by Val Thomas. We started the back porch here in Washington State, but all of the organizations are global. They're open to anybody across the world. We have members from all over. UK, Canada, US, Australia, South Africa. We have a guy in the Discord from Indonesia. So we have really all over the world.
It's
And
incredible.
the idea with the back porch, at least, is to eventually go 24 hours. We're going to be a 24-hour drop-in Zoom. And so we want to hit all of the time zones. So it'll be easier to find people from each time zone that can keep it going 24 hours.
Yeah. I think it's awesome that it's so international already and so moving in that direction. Like even moving to places where like English may not even be the main language or like the core primary, whatever it's called. But because like to some extent, I think this is what I've been noticing in some of the counterweight discussion as far as culture and international issues go. A lot of social justice seems to have been formed based on American issues and American culture clashes. And before we even started the live stream, me and Neil were, and a little bit Jeff, we were just talking about how America has a lot of different subcultures that are very different from each other, and it's been that way pretty much since the beginning. So maybe, for better or worse, America has been like a ticking time bomb, and social justice I guess is getting exported to other areas and to some extent is arising naturally, but it seems like it's more of a Western thing and it's more of an American thing. And there's just other parts in the world where like I have people I'm friends with from other parts of the world that if you go there, it's like there's no way social justice would make sense at all. It doesn't, it's crazy. It's like when I hear about people protesting in Canada about tearing down statues and complaining about slave owners, but they don't really have anywhere near the history with slavery of Black people that America has. So even if you could say a little bit of social justice makes a little bit of sense in America, I don't think it makes any sense in Canada if we're talking that like that example. So it's like a cultural mess. I think it's so hard for the average person to understand all of the different culture clashes happening at the same time right now.
And I think a lot of it is being accelerated or inflamed a bit by social media, both internally and outside of the United States from foreign countries and actors.
There's a
Yeah.
couple of things with social media that for the individual that hasn't got a voice, it kind of creates well, until recently, an uncensored space to have a voice. I'd say that that's becoming less and less so. It's becoming more and more censored by the organizations that run social media. Um, and there's a natural echo chamber built into the algorithms, because so that people can find content that they would like. So it creates an echo chamber. And so you get that confirmation bias, and in-group bias appears more strongly in social media than it would do in the street or in a physical space. And the other side of it is that this is capitalism at work, which is something I don't know whether social justice really wants to acknowledge, but it's a very capitalist model in that corporations and social media, because social media are different, just another form of corporation. They want to make sure that their bottom line is not hit. So if aligning with a social movement will mean they can sell products or not have products boycotted, then they will do so for purely financial reasons. And it appears as all of the companies across the UK and the US are, declaring their allegiance with theory, with critical theory, but what they're declaring is, we don't want to lose any money by people boycotting our products. So if for now we need to say we believe in this, then sure, yeah, we believe in this, buy our products. Like, we believe in this so much, buy our trainers, like buy our open an account with us, subscribe to our services. But if in 5 years' time, or 10 years' time, these movements are passe and gone, and then these same companies will be like, no, we never agreed with that stuff. Buy our products, sign up for our services. And so there's a lot of money sort of being thrown into this, but it's a lot of money because there's an expected return on investment, not because there's any particular actual. I don't think most of these companies really care either way. Like, the only color they care about is green, right? Like, it's about the color of your money. It's not about the color of your skin or anything else. So, and social media can really inflame that and conflate that. But the whole in-group bias and confirmation bias aspect of social media as a mechanism by which people essentially run an algorithm of finding content, right? Like, it just sort of seems to inflame these differences. And when you've got so many subcultures that are participating in this, they seem to just rub up against one another. Like, there's not a social media that's a third space, right? That's a concept that I really like, a social media that's a third space. And I think, and actually these things may well be being developed on blockchains, because they're decentralized, and because you cannot have censorship on a decentralized network. You just can't censor it. It's not possible to do so. So I actually have some kind of hope around, or expectation even around, the types of spaces that you guys are participating in and creating. And I've been able to attend a few of these spaces, becoming actually encoded into social media at some point in probably the not so distant future. And I wouldn't be surprised actually if some of these things already exist and I just don't know about them. But yeah, I don't know where I'm quite going with this right now, to be honest. I've just kind of got
I've
on a bit
seen
of a
places like
moment.
Discord are the Zooms. If you consider Zoom social media, we have Clubhouse now, so why not Zoom? I've seen those be kind of third spacey. Like there's some Discord servers function as third spaces, and there's certain Zoom communities that can function as a third space. So I think that there is a small section of social media where that is possible.
Yeah, I heard about something yesterday called Retalk, Retalk, which I've not looked into, but and then it seems to be about centrist and maybe slightly politically right spaces, sort of a purposely built social
I'm
media
looking it up
platform.
now.
So, and I think it's a clubhouse type of design in terms of like moderators, open conversations, high numbers of participants, focused conversations. But with the moderation, it's meant to be, as at least the way it was described, it's meant to be um, around inclusivity. Yeah, I'm not advocating it because I've not even looked at it. I only heard about it yesterday, but it's just another new space that's being created.
Yeah. I'll since we're talking about technology and building spaces and how that affects people. In the research that I was doing last year, that led where I incorporated the third place, I also heavily focused on self-determination theory. And just as a quick reminder, the three, in case anybody doesn't know or needs to be reminded, the three traits of self-determination theory are autonomy, competence, and interconnection. And so we've been talking a lot about those three today. And I really think they've come up in ways that sometimes it's even unexpected. But something I found in my research that was really powerful that I keep coming back to that just is such a mind-bending thing. But it's that relationships create the environment itself. That as
Mm.
relationships develop and you build outward, it's one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. You start with two individuals, and then you get to multiples of those, and you multiply even more, and before you know it, you have a whole community. And the way that each individual person and each relationship um, interacts, and like your personality disposition, your values, your desires, what's at the forefront of your mind on a daily basis, all of that begins to literally affect and build the environment around you. And people, it's counterintuitive, and I don't think it's well understood or well known, but there's a relationship between the environment and your behavior. So, and even you could say, as one person, your relationship to yourself that you revolve around in your little locus of control is going to build your immediate environment around you, like, say, your bedroom where you spend your time much of the day or evening. And so if you can keep this in mind and kind of play around with that idea, relationships build the environment influences behavior, then I think we can use that concept as one of our guiding tools for building a third space. Because in the research I'm doing right now, when it comes to self-determination, that I see as fundamentally the definition of empowerment, liberation, freedom, however you want to say that, uh, there's a gap. There's a gap where people are disempowered, and then there's the ideal of self-determination, and the hero's journey is how do you cover this gap, essentially. And I think one of the ways that people get stuck, even those who have some understanding of these philosophies and these tools, is that we don't yet know how to cover the gap very well at all. And this is what we're struggling with. And self determination, your hero's journey, is definitely not linear. It's not just step A, B, C, one foot in front of the other. It's really almost paradoxical that the things that disempower people, whether it's internal or somewhat external or it's both, they are barriers that can reinforce their disempowerment, and they feel as if they're trapped and they don't know how to get out of it. They're not competent enough to better learn self-determination. That's a paradox. They're not autonomous enough to have access to high quality enough choices. They're not interconnected enough in decent relationships. So they're stuck, and we need to find ways to counterintuitively get around these paradoxes where then uh, my philosophy with this that I'm really developing is you can almost use a person's disempowered states to their advantage rather than their disadvantage. The source of the suffering or the pain or their poverty, their loss, can be used to their advantage. You subvert it. And once you figure out ways to do that, then they can start. It's almost like alchemy. You basically turn lead into gold. You literally transform your disempowerment into self-determination. And if we can figure out how to do those things, this sounds really crazy, but there's some very simple things that we can do, then we can also do the same process, not just at the individual level, but the community level. And we can start building those third places. It's like a refuge, it's a place to arrive. And all of a sudden, the environment itself is so powerful that it has such an impact on people's behavior that they start to bring forward their better selves. They start to become less externally driven, like a ping pong thrown around in a tornado, and they start to be able to dance. And it becomes this improvisation, and they start to discover those sides of themselves where it's like, yes, I can be playful, I can be humorous, I can be wise, even if I have all these flaws and horrible things that have happened to me. And if you get 5 people that discover that together at a similar time in the same place, then all of a sudden you have something magical because they experience it together. And then their hero's journey becomes shared. And it's like you have a little audience for your hero's journey and you to theirs. And everything that people seek in fame, they actually find in this shared personal hero's journey together that is intimate but is individual. This is the vision I'm grasping at. It's just crazy. I can't even really imagine it, but it's like it's right there. And we just need a few people to say, I'm grabbing on, I'm going to see what happens. Heidi ho.
It's right there because it's already happening, and let's do it. Like it's not a vision. It happens. I see it happen in my communities, and I think we should do it too. That's what we're trying to do anyway. That's what part of this podcast is for. So yeah, I think we're all there.
And interestingly, like the nearest analogy I can think of what you were describing there, that is the therapeutic relationship. And from a perspective of psychotherapy, what I mean is that the very basic concept of the therapeutic relationship is you provide a container, one that provides a safe space. It very much fits the third space in terms of you can bring whatever you want. You're not going to be judged for it. You'd have a client and a therapist in this particular structure. And the way a way therapy should work, in my belief, is that within this container, a person can explore those insecurities, those aspects of themselves which is not allowing the autonomy to appear, that keeps them down, so to speak. And they can explore that in a way that doesn't reinforce it, but that just kind of unpacks it and finds out, because it always has purpose. There's a reason why we do these things. There's a reason why we have these sides to ourselves, and they're normally ways to keep us safe, quite possibly not functional ways, but they tend to have a very actually essentially healthy purpose, that they're there to look after us in some way. So in that therapeutic relationship, you provide the space by which somebody can explore that until they can find out the gold within it, like taking the alchemy that you spoke of, that within that heavy dark material that weighs them down and keeps them down is actually kind of like the rock. If you break through, there's a diamond or there's gold in that rock, like there isn't under a mountain. And then once you find that, that becomes a source of energy and light and becomes lifting. So I kind of see a parallel with the therapeutic relationship, but sounds like something that works in a kind of peer and group setting rather than just a kind of one-to-one weekly for 50 minutes type of the way a therapeutic relationship may be much more structured. This sounds like a bit more inviting for anybody to be able to dive into and see how it goes. So yeah, it's interesting how that all comes together.
Yeah, that's really a cool comparison. Yeah, I mean, the third space is also not everything. There's a reason it's called third, because I mentioned the first is considered home, the second is work, and then there's the third space. But it is an interesting comparison to see some of the similarities because, say, in the therapeutic setting, for one of the people, it's their second place, their place of work. So it's this really complex thing where it's almost like most of us are living in multiple worlds at the same time. This kind of brings me down a slightly different direction, a bit of a curveball here, but something I've been contemplating a lot recently that's been somewhat intense and imaginative for me to experience is just getting to know more intensely how each person's experience of reality is not only subjective, but the difference in each person's subjective experience is probably a lot more intense and vibrant and all encompassing with much more depth than we usually assume. And it's like,
Mm.
I can't spend every day of my life imagining every person's subjective experience that in depth. It's impossible for your brain to maintain that. You really can only go in depth into one subjective experience at a time. And say when you read a fictional story or you play a video game or you watch a movie, you sort of leave behind your story for a moment, a couple hours or so, and you enter this whole other story. And you ideally, if it's a good experience, you get really immersed in it. And I've been starting to interact with real life more like that and just see the subtleties that we miss a lot. That on a basic level, everyone feels differently in their own body. You have a different body shape, and people have different life experiences. Some people have health issues at different ages, and these things have such a profound impact that we often don't really put into words. So we're a lot of times stuck simplifying, and I think this relates back to maybe what Jeff said about concept of mind, that sometimes people will assume that their default is other people's default. And it's hard to break out of that because it's so hard to spend time inhabiting another subjective experience different from your own default. But if you practice these things, if you're doing creative, imaginative things, just as a side note, empathy and imagination happen in the same part of the brain. So empathy is actually a form of imagination. You are imagining yourself in someone else's experience. So if we practice those things, I think you can build that muscle for that creative. It's like you rev the lawnmower, you build your creative, imaginative muscle, and this makes us more empathetic. And if you go on the flip side of this coin, for ideological people, they tend to get obsessive. And if they continue to obsess, they get very rigid in their own reality, and they completely forget what it's like to experience outside of that rigid reality. So if we can get with each other and empathize and improvise, then we might be able to return some of that flexibility and some of that empathy.
I like that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I think that's a really nice note. Yeah.
Yeah. I I guess we can wrap it up here on that. I can't think of a better
Sure.
way to end. Neil,
Yeah, I
Yeah.
you've been
suppose it's
great.
after 5.
Yeah, that's a great journey. I think the past hour and a half has been a really really interesting, and it's been a learning journey for me anyway. It's like I'm my my mind rather than just my brain, and my mind is growing with all of this, and I've got a lot to I've got a lot to kind of like work with and play with as a consequence of this. So I actually would love to come back at some point in the future and maybe have another conversation about something different, or maybe continue with this one. Um, I think
Well, I was
I
about to
think
tell you to come back anytime. So
well,
anytime.
yeah. In that case, I will like pop in with some questions at some point when we have other guests as well, if that's okay. Because yeah, this is a third space in itself, isn't it?
Oh,
Like
good.
yeah, I feel like I can bring whatever I want to this, and that it's not judgmental, and it can be explored, and we can have different opinions, and at the same time, there's that emergence of new ideas and or the growth or extension of existing ones. Like, yeah, this is very healthy. I enjoy being here. So thank you both. I really appreciate being invited along today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, sir.
Awesome.
We'll be doing it again next week.
That's right.
Cool.
Maybe I don't know. I'm going to throw out a few announcements. Well, first of all, the first announcement I want to make. One of our commenters in the live chat, Ultra Picaro, shout out to you. When I was talking, I referenced Dr. Seuss in my rant, and they said, "One fish, two fish." Dr. Seuss, I'm triggered. I just because Dr. Seuss got canceled recently, so that was coincidental and funny. But I guess at the end of the show here, just as shout outs and reminders and announcements, me and Jeff are really trying to build this podcast in a different way than a lot of podcasts and like YouTube content, where we're emphasizing the interactive aspect to it. So, Neil, you calling this, I don't know if you're referring to specifically our podcast right now. It sounded like it, or maybe a little more broadly than that, but we are definitely trying to build it into have that sense of third space to whatever degree we can. And so anybody who wants to interact in our live chat or who wants to be a guest on the show, that's there's definitely opportunity. Now is your chance to be an early adopter because almost nobody knows about us yet. So we're like the secret newest hit with all the hipsters. Uh, but and the other opportunity I see is we want to have audience participation towards the end of the show, roughly the last 30 minutes. Something that I've been doing in Counterweight recently is if somebody wants to make a news announcement for some event with social justice or something where they want to get it more public attention, maybe somebody's being attacked by social justice, or there's some really good news, they're building some new community, whatever is vaguely related to our podcast. We really, I think, if I can speak for both me and Jeff, and I think we both have a shared view on this generally, that we want to hear the good, the bad, the ugly from people. We want to
I
hear,
love that.
like, connect with what's going on in people's lives. And I want to, like, really encourage each person. If you have a goal in mind or you're looking for a goal, you're excited by a hero's journey, find something and just do it and let us know. And we want to have that interactive community building aspect. And our contact email for the podcast is jeffandnemo@gmail.com. And that'll reach both me and Jeff. And whichever one of us feels where it's more relevant, we'll respond primarily. But we're both here, and you can find me at least on Counterweight. The website's counterweightsupport.com. And we usually put all the links for other groups, the Back Porch, CTA. So please hop on board and join wherever you see fit and let us know. You can be a leader, essentially. I'm excited for whatever other people want to contribute.
Yeah, I think that's great. And we have the Discord server, and you can come hang out on the back porch. You can email me for the link, and we have the Wednesday Zoom for that's devoted specifically to critical social justice for the most part. So I can send you the link to that as well. jeffandnemo@gmail.com.
I
Neil, once
just
again, you've been fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, it's been a
yes,
pleasure. Thank you both for hosting. It's been cool.
yeah.
Do you have any last minute announcements or comments?
No, I put Jeff and Nemo at Gmail in the chat just now, and yeah, I appreciate both of you too. We got to keep collaborating.
Yeah.
Is it offensive if I say it, I call us gentlemen? Gentlemen of the
I
round
don't know.
table
I
of the
so rarely get called that. I don't know how to react. So it's not offense.
I I don't. You can call me whatever you like. Like it really doesn't bother me anyway. But yeah, I like that phrase. What's wrong with being gentle? Like I think there's not enough gentle in the world. We can do with more of it. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Neil, do you have anything last words you want to throw out there?
No, just that I really support what you're doing. I was referring to this particular media as a third space, this podcast, and when I mentioned that, as well as what else you're doing, but I did really feel that this podcast does actually serve that function. So I would encourage anybody out there that wants to participate, that wants to ask questions, that would like to be a guest, to get in touch with these guys, because it's very easy to just have a live conversation and put it to work. So don't feel shy. Just put yourself out there, see what happens. I'm sure it'll all be good.
Well, thank you, sir.
And
Thank
fingers
you.
crossed for the future. And you just roll the dice,
We'll
and
make a
then
future. Yeah.
yeah. Hopefully, we're not playing oppression Olympics dice. Oh, I'm a white straight man. I lost the game. All right. I have nothing else to say. I'm just making jokes now. I'm sure I'll see you guys around, and me and Jeff will be back next Saturday.
Same time. Yep. Have a great week, everyone.
Thank you. You too.
Take care.